Welcome back. This is Module 4. So Module 4 is pretty much a review of chemistry. So I'm sure you have all had chemistry. So it's just a review. So we'll go over the basics that we need to know for AP Environmental. So basically matter and atoms should be pretty basic, but matter is anything that has mass, takes up space. When we measure mass, it's the amount of matter that's inside something. So your mass won't change as you go from, like, let's say one planet to another, because it's the amount of stuff inside you. Your weight will change because of gravity. So weight is just the measurement of how much force of gravity is applied to you or to the object. All right, so looking at atoms and molecules, an atom is the smallest particle that anything is made up of. And an element is just composed of a bunch of atoms, and it can be broken down into smaller components. So everything that's on the periodic table would be an element, and it can't be broken down anymore. So here's the parts of the atom in the diagram, the picture. So you've got the electrons and the electron shell and the cloud on the outside of the nucleus, and then you've got the protons and the neutrons within the nucleus. Pretty basic, so I'm sure you learned that. Well, you had it. If you took my earth science class, we went over that. But I'm sure, like I said, you had chemistry. All right, so radioactivity, sometimes we measure things, radioactive things, but in AP Environmental Science, we might be finding the age of something. We might be looking at pollutants within an organism. And for example, like DDT with the Borneo cats. So DDT gets inside an organism, causes a lot of havoc, but it does break down. Some things break down really slow, some things break down really fast. And that's usually referred to as the half-life. So toxins is really what we would use radioactivity or the half-life for in this class. So half-life is just what time does it take for it to break down in half. So if you start with 100 grams of a substance and it breaks down and now you have 50 grams, how long did that take? So that's half of the amount. So whatever time that took would be half-life. So the question I have on here, what is the half-life of a parent isotope decaying into a daughter that takes 5 minutes to decay from 100 to 50 grams? So think about it for a minute. Should be pretty easy. So it should be 5 minutes, right? It went from 100 grams to 50 grams in 5 minutes. So 5 minutes would be the half-life. So some things have seconds for a half-life. Some things have billions of years for a half-life. So it really just depends on the substance that we're looking at. All right, so here's looking at carbon dating, and you can see the number of half-lives that have gone by from 0 to 5. So if we look at the chart, we can figure out what the half-life is. The half-life would be 5,730 because after one half-life, which was 5,730 years, we have 50% left. And then if we look at further half-lives, we've got 2 half-lives have gone by, so it's basically just double the number of years. And then it's this number, the percent, cut in half. And then you continue on. So each one of these, if you notice, go up 5,730 years. And as time goes by, that time, 5,730 years, we have half of the substance left. So after 28,000 years, you're going to have in the organism 3% left over. And so we can use this to figure out how old the organism is. Once it gets past 4 half-lives or so for carbon, it's very hard to distinguish how much percent is in there. So we can only use carbon dating for things that are more recently dead. If we're dating dinosaurs, we have to use something that's in the rock. So it could be uranium, it could be radon, it could be something like that. But it's something within the rock. So carbon dating would be for more recent, ice age. Well, actually not even ice age. It'd be more like the terms of humans, human remains, things like that. All right. So chemical bonds, 3 types of chemical bonds. We've got covalent, ionic, and hydrogen. So like I said, these should all be a review, but it pops up every once in a while where we need to know how things are bonded. But covalent bond is when they share electrons. So you can see in this methane molecule, you've got 1 carbon, 4 hydrogens. And so they're sharing a bond right here. And so carbon is satisfied in that it has 8 electrons in its outer shell. Hydrogen satisfied, it has 2 in its outer shell. So everything is satisfied, it's sharing, and it's held together tightly. And then ionic bonds give or take. So ionic bonds would be like this example, sodium. So you've got sodium and chlorine making up what's commonly referred to as table salt. So the sodium only has 1 electron in its outer shell. And so it falls back on its previous shell, its second shell, which is full. And then chlorine only needs 1 electron in its outer shell. So sodium gives that to chlorine, and now they're bonded. So chlorine has a full outer shell. You can see down here, sodium fell back on its previous shell because shells don't exist with no electrons. So it falls back, and then it forms salt. So that's ionic. And then we've got something, a special kind of bond called a hydrogen bond. So a hydrogen bond is a pretty weak bond, but it only occurs with hydrogen. And so if hydrogen is attached to something, then that would be a hydrogen bond. And sometimes they can be polar. So water is a great example of this. Water is polar, and I'll show you why. So if we look at water here, we've got oxygen, hydrogen, and so here's our hydrogen bonds. Oxygen is satisfied with 8 in its outer shell, hydrogen is satisfied with 2, but oxygen is a pretty large molecule compared to hydrogen. And so what happens is these electrons, because they're being shared, they are on one side of the hydrogen molecule. And so hydrogen only having 2 electrons, it tends to have a positive, because there's no electrons over here, positive end, and same with this one. And then because there's so many electrons over here, that this end tends to be negative. And so that's what's called polarity. And it gives water some really special properties. So it's actually really important. I'm sure you guys learned about transfers of nutrients and things across the cell membrane. So, or keeping things out of the cell membrane. So a lot of that transport has to do with this polarity of water. So it's important when we talk about water and how things transport in the body regarding toxins later on. All right, so water is pretty vital. We can't exist without water. It has a lot of unique properties, which is really convenient for the way of life that we have. So there's these properties here. We've got surface tension. So I want you to think of the function for these things. So surface tension is the cohesion of water molecules at the surface. So for example, I'll give you a hint, but water bugs, they can seem to float on the surface of the water. That might be a good function. You know, things tend to stick. There's my kitty. So things tend to stick to the surface. So it just helps to move things along or to prevent things from coming in. Capillary action, this is where you've got molecules of water sticking to each other, and so, or to something else. So for example, you've got plants. Plants move things through their roots, so they don't suck up the water. The water moves because of capillary action. So just like a paper towel, if you were to stick a paper towel onto water, it's going to move up by capillary action. So it moves through the little particles of paper towel, and then it moves up through the paper towel. So it does the same thing with the roots of a plant. So pretty important for the plants themselves to have this capillary action. And then high boiling melting points. So that's pretty convenient for, think about the fish that live in the water. If it froze over, if it didn't just freeze on the surface, then we would have frozen ponds with fish that are dead. So that wouldn't work out very good. Also, if water heated up and cooled off really fast, then that wouldn't be very good for organisms as well. So having a high boiling point and melting point, 100 degrees Celsius for water boiling, and then 0 for freezing. So that makes it really convenient for organisms here on Earth. And then the next bullet, many substances dissolve well in water because their polar molecules bond easily with other polar molecules. So think of examples of things that dissolve that we might use. Things that we put into water that we need dissolved, maybe minerals, maybe things like that we need for our bodies to function. And then it expands when it freezes. So that is an insulating, like I talked about with the ponds, that helps to insulate the rest of the pond. So you don't get water freezing necessarily underneath. You get it just on the surface. All right, so acids, bases, pH, still chemistry review. Acid is anything that has a pH of 0 to 6, and then a base is anything from 8 to 14. And pH is just the power of hydrogen. That's all it means. And so as you go up or down the scale of acids or bases, it increases by powers of 10 each time. So something that's a 2 on the scale versus a 3 is 10 times stronger acid than the 3 is. So it's pretty significant difference there. All right, so here's our scale. So neutral is 7, and then anything above that is a base. Anything below that's an acid. And for life to function, we need to stay pretty close to the neutral range. So rainwater tends to be slightly acidic. Acid rain is pretty bad. But a lot of people, when they think of acid rain, they think of, burning their skin or something like that. And we will talk about acid rain quite a few times in here, especially with air pollution and aquatic life. But soda is actually way more acidic than acid rain. Like for us, we can't tell that it's raining acid rain. But the plants, think about if you were to water your plant with soda, with a Pepsi or something, it's not going to work out very good. And same with amphibians or things that rely on certain pH in the water. It can definitely affect them. So that's why we look at pH. And then another interesting fact, Iron Mountain Mine, so near here, you can see it as you come into Shasta down by the tennis courts, that has the lowest pH in the world, which is kind of cool. I mean, it's a mine and we have kind of created that, but it's a super fun site, which we'll talk about later, but they are cleaning it up. And, but it's the most acidic place on earth. And it just has to do with the copper and the iron, oxidizing and mixing and just creating this toxic mess. But people come from all over the world to study it here in Redding, because of its acidity. And we've actually seen that there's some organisms, sometimes some types of bacteria and things that actually live in that. And it's, I think the most they've measured, the most acidic that they've measured is a -2. So that's extremely acidic. Way more acidic than battery acid. It's like, what is that? It is 1,000 times stronger than battery acid. It's amazing. But anyway, so we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about Superfund sites later on. All right. And then if we look at the way things act in cells, we've got or compounds, we've got inorganic and organic compounds. Once again, chemistry. So inorganic simply just means that it doesn't contain carbon that's bound to anything. Well, it's a compound that does not contain the element carbon, or contains carbon bound to things other than hydrogen. So notice how we've got NH3. Which is ammonium, sodium, we've got water, we've got carbon dioxide. So none of the carbons are attached to hydrogens. And so that makes it inorganic as far as that goes. And then the organic compounds, so it's carbon attached to hydrogen or carbon bonds. And so those would be organic. So our examples here, we've got glucose and we've got methane. And that's it for Module 4.